She has her own mandate, so she's the elected deputy leader. So it's not like Keir Starmer can get rid of her, despite him trying once. She was announced as the Levelling Up Secretary, and then they took that off her job title. She went back to being Housing Secretary. She hasn't got an office for Deputy Prime Minister. We'll talk about it in a minute, but Rachel Reeves made the big housing announcement. She's now talking about local government, something that she wasn't previously dug into. Let's take a look at each of the key members of this new quad. The Sunday Times of Whitehall editor, Gabriel Pogrund, is here in the studio. So we've got the four. Why this four? How have they sort of... We'll take them one by one in a minute, but how has it ended up being this four?
So I think, essentially, Keir Starmer has this notion that the way Whitehall traditionally works is no longer fit for purpose, and he has been told by Sue Gray and a lot of these kind of insiders, people who've been in the system and have since departed, that he needs a way of radiating influence out from the centre. And the quad that he's picked to do that are that kind of combination of people who know how it works but have a critique of it, and people who are going to ensure that Labour values, as he would characterise it, are heard in the corridors of power. So, you've got Keir as the PM, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, Pat McFadden, who was once upon a time Tony Blair's political secretary, now reborn as the man in charge of the machinery of government as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And then lastly, Angela Rayner, whose role at the moment I think is one of the most interesting questions at the top of government, because we had anticipated that there would be an office of the Deputy Prime Minister, which has not yet come to pass. But her presence is designed to make sure that, I think there's once this distinction drawn by Peter Hyman. He's a former Blair advisor as well, now works with Keir Starmer. He said that Tony represented the new, Gordon Brown represented the Labour and the new Labour formulation. Well, Angela Rayner is there to provide the Labour. And so how they all operate together is going to be absolutely foundational to the next 5 years.
We've also got John McTernan, who was political secretary to Tony Blair, the same job that Pat McFadden also did. He's now senior advisor to the PR company BCW. Hi, John.
Hiya.
Do you think the before we come on to the four characters this time, do you think that a sort of more formalised quad or couple, if it was just Tony and Gordon, was there a way that you could have used the structures of government so that they had got on better when they were in power?
Look, I think one important thing that Tony and Gordon did was they soaked up all of the reporting. Kind of the TBGBs meant that most of the political commentary, when they were rubbing along together or rubbing each other up their own way, was actually about the Labour Party. So it crowds out the opposition, crowds out their ability to talk to get a message across, to even have an insight or to be part of the public conversation. So there's something about having your own internal drama that's quite helpful. But there's also the fact that, Tony and Gordon were products of the 90s, well, the late 80s and early 90s. The Labour Party is going to be governing in the second quarter of the 21st century. So we need quite a lot of new thinking. And the thing that I like about the approach that Keir and Sue are taking is they've at least found a problem to which the answer is some form of civil service reform. I normally hate discussions about civil service reform because they're actually, nobody ever described the problem they're trying to solve. In this case, having missions and making everybody work to the mission, that gives you an idea of what the challenge is. And I think, often when talking to Labour insiders, I say, well, the vaccine task force is a really, really good example because it was set up. It had, it had a mandate, which was save lives by any means necessary. And it had a sunset date, which is it was going to do itself out of business. And I think some of the innovations that were learned around the vaccine task force could be picked up on. I think other things have been effectively missions without, that could be drawn. And so, I think there is a problem to solve, but it's actually how the country is mobilized to decarbonize, or how the country is mobilized to improve its health. We can't simply have a national sickness service. We need everybody dedicated in their own communities to looking after their own health. Yeah. So I like the mobilizing and liberating nature of it. It's not. It's a clean break, and I credit Peter Hyman with a lot of the thinking.
Dare I ask you? Could you name Keir Starmer's 5 missions?
Oh, this is I'm not even a politician. Do I have to be subject to stuff like this?
I've got them.
We've got 6 steps to 5 missions.
Economic growth, clean energy superpower, take back our streets, break down barriers to opportunity, and build an NHS fit for the future. And the idea being that because lots of those things overlap between government departments, what you need is a sort of mechanism for bringing people together and banging heads together with these mission boards.
That's right. So, I mean, it is. I was speaking to somebody in Number 10 a couple of days ago who was actually saying that these, mission boards are a sort of question mark hovering over them. I don't think they've been created yet, and there's always been this question as to whether they'll be or do more than traditional cabinet committees. I mean, taken at their best, I think they'll be an effective way of cohering the expertise and the resource of Whitehall in a way which kind of transcends the traditional silos. I was speaking to one kind of former Whitehall civil servant who was saying that the real question is whether these committees will have financial clout and the ability to say to individual departments, we're reaching into your budget and actually deploying your resource and finance in service of this goal, rather than permanent secretaries being fully in control of the abacus and their annual budgets. But this mission idea is, I mean, there's always a kind of really interesting political question as to how Starmer positions himself. He's got some people around him who I think there's a certain technocratic tendency. He has some people who are sort of insurgents who specialised in, the factional warfare of taking over the party and winning it back from the left. And some there, present Starmer as a guy who should be harnessing populism. He yesterday was characterising himself as somebody who rejected it. He described it as snake oil. And I think that if you look at the messaging from the first fortnight, there's a lot of emphasis on this idea that Starmer is Mr. Fix-It. He is basically going to use missions and the mission boards and the quad and the machinery of the state and legislation and partnership between the state and business to just make things work better. I don't claim any intellectual originality over this thought, but I think he didn't mention AI at all in his King's speech. He's not speaking the language of the future and revolutions. He's speaking in terms of let's use Whitehall to make the country work better.
Well, that was interesting because actually, I suppose looking at those missions, they're a bit woolly. Kickstart economic growth, secure the highest sustained growth in the G7. Take back our streets and all that. Whereas the thing that John was talking about, get vaccines in people's arms is a very clear, like, these are the staging posts, and then we'll know when we've done it. And I suppose that's a slight difference. Well, let's move on now to the Deputy Prime Minister and Housing Secretary, Angela Rayner. Now, in her first week in the job, she's written to council leaders without devolved responsibility, saying, come on, join the devolution revolution, as she was calling it, extra powers on transport, housing and employment. Now, what's so interesting, I think you're right, Gabriel, that Angela Rayner's role in all this is really interesting because she has her own mandate, so she's the elected deputy leader, so it's not like Keir Starmer can get rid of her despite him trying once. She was announced as the levelling up secretary, and then they took that off her job title. She went back to being housing secretary. She hasn't got an office for deputy prime minister. We'll talk about it in a minute, but Rachel Reeves made the big housing announcement. She's now talking about local government, something that she wasn't previously dug into. What's going on with Angela Rayner?
And just as a brief postscript to that, it's also the case that her New Deal for Working People, which I believe has been rebranded now as Labour's plan to make work pay, that has been carved off and sent into the Department for Business run by Johnny Reynolds. And Rayner's team now say she remains a strategic lead. But there's no doubt that
was when she was the Shadow Secretary of State for the Future of Work, a made-up job, but very much her thing about more employment rights and her relationship with the unions was very key to her role in Labour and opposition.
That's right. I mean, because obviously she sort of sees herself, and she is a link between she's a link between the leadership and at times the Parliamentary Labour Party, at times the trade unions, and certainly she personifies and embodies a large part of the Labour tradition, and her oversight of the workers' rights remit was a reflection of that, and she asked for it after that botched 2021 reshuffle. She was offered various baubles, social care, this, that, the other. That was a really important thing to her. So I think it is interesting that Johnny Reynolds, I mean, one might say it's inevitable given that her department housing is a big enough remit on its own. I think like the real, inevitably the proof will be in the pudding in terms of how far the government will go on housing. I think, let's give them credit. In their first week or few weeks, they've said they're going to reintroduce housing targets, which at least brings us back to the kind of settlement we had in 2010. But I am, still curious as to, how serious they are about making enemies when it comes to, because, restoring targets is one thing, but then what happens when people appeal and reject them and all the rest of it? To which I say we don't have answers yet. But I think, Angela Rayner's position is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's going to be an ongoing story. But there was a good piece in Bloomberg this week about this fact that a lot of the sort of usual trappings of that office have not yet materialised.
And John, certainly in 1997, John Prescott was very clear about what he wanted. He ended up with a super department. He was Deputy Prime Minister. He ended up with a super department as well. Is it overplay? I mean, they are both Northern MPs. They're directly elected deputy leaders. They reach parts of the electorate and aggravate parts of the electorate that others can't. How careful does Keir Starmer need to be to keep Rachel Reeves happy, do you think, John McTernan?
Do you mean Rayner?
So what did I say?
You said Rachel Reeves.
Well, I said Rachel Reeves. I meant Angela Rayner. Yeah, we'll come to Rachel Reeves in a sec. How important is it that he keeps...
It's absolutely critical for everybody in and around politics to understand the importance of Angela. Angela is, in some dimensions, like John. Tony used to say to other prime ministers, European prime ministers, that if you want to make reforms as a social democrat, you need someone like John, who can reach to other bits of the movement. Angela definitely can deliver other parts of the Labour movement. I was speaking to people at the TC recently who see her as a key link to that traditional part of the Labour movement. That's important. I think, you also got to understand, I wrote about this for the Telegraph last year. In one sense, she's got some of the charisma that you associate with Boris Johnson. She reaches to people outside politics. She's got a cut through with ordinary people, and that's a really, if you're going to have a government that's mission driven, sounds a bit technocratic, doesn't have as many characters as maybe Labour used to have in the past, or all parties used to have in the past, having a character with charisma like Angela is really important. And anybody who ever knew what the office of the Deputy Prime Minister was in the coalition days and would have advised, and I definitely advised Angela as a team, do not accept a dusty room somewhere in 75 and say, I've got an office. The point is, the Deputy Prime Minister and deputy leader with her own mandate has got a spending department, and I think the real issue of Keir's approach is going to be cabinet government. Politics is back in cabinet government. Government means, a deputy prime minister who's got a spending department can ally easily with Bridget Phillipson, who's got a spending department, and West Streeting's got a spending department. And suddenly, you can't have one of the things that Gordon was able to play with the PLP was that everybody secretly thought that maybe he'd raise more taxes to spend more money. I don't think anybody in the PLP is burdened by the illusion that Rachel secretly spend. And so, in that sense, the balance of power in the cabinet is really interesting. That you've got, you might put Wes in one thing politically, but Wes also nearly lost his seat in the same way that that Jess Phillips nearly lost his seat and Shabana nearly lost his seat. So the political pressures on Wes are different than on other members of the cabinet, and he's also got a spending department. And I think I've been saying for a while, politics is back in a very different way than it was. Discipline in opposition is one thing. You can't tell cabinet ministers not to respond to the needs and demands of their departments. You can't simply say there is no money, because everybody knows Treasury's always got money. So the politics of spending is going to be interesting. And Angela has a really huge role there. And my observation on Rachel making the spending announcements, I was housing advisor for Tony Blair for a period. The biggest issue you ever had was getting Treasury to back plans around housing. Rachel announcing it was the biggest victory for the Ministry of Housing you could ever imagine.
Really interesting. Yeah. That's so interesting. You can view one thing in both ways. Either it's a grabbing of Angela's turf, or a huge vote of confidence in her plan.
Treasury officials agree with what Angela wants now.
Yeah. Just before we move on, John, tell us about. Let's move on to Pat McFadden. What is the role of political secretary, which you both did for Tony Blair, and what does that knowledge bring to? Why is Pat McFadden, not the world's most well-known politician, now one of the top 4 people in the country?
he's at the top through talent and through diligence and through a brain, a political sensitivity, a political understanding. The political secretary is a job that I held, it's a job that Pat held, it's a job that Sally Morgan, Baroness Morgan held. And what you are is really, you're the party's representative in number 10. So you head an office, you deal with the General Secretary of the Labour Party regularly, you deal with the unions regularly, you deal with the bits of the movement that aren't necessarily in Parliament, but they're really important to us, the party in the country, the party in the unions. You're involved in election strategy, involved in by-election strategy, local election strategy, all of those things. And what you bring to the Prime Minister is, this is a potential political problem on the horizon. If we do this, you can diffuse it. So you're always horizon scanning. You're always in relationships and networks. You're always working with backbenchers to listen to them, to feed through. You work with the PPS, who's the link to the backbenchers. I had a group, but I was then Tony's political secretary 2005, 2007, when there were more former ministers than our majority. And so former ministers, when they're in the cabinet or in parliaments, they always want the whips to whip people to vote for their policies. On the backbench, they suddenly find their conscience and they're independent.
Yes,
I had to run a called the non-embittered former ministers. There were people who were on the backbench but were still loyal to the leader.
Still loyal to do it. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
John, thanks so much for that. John McTernan, there, former political secretary to Tony Blair, and Gabriel Pogrund, Whitehall editor of the Sunday Times. Up next, we're going to dip back into when the Quad worked before, or did it? The Conservatives and the Lib Dems in the coalition from 2010 to 2015.